Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to take you back 127 years. It's the Wizard of Oz. Now, what does the Wizard of Oz have to do with the 1896 presidential campaign? Did you ever hear that about how the Wizard of Oz might be the story of the 1896 presidential campaign? That's, of course, Dorothy, right? And why is this not working here? Hang on 1 second, let me get this to work. So there's Dorothy, right? And that's the Wizard of Oz. And that's the Cowardly Lion, right? Remember? And this is the Tin Man. And there's the Scarecrow. That's the Tin Man. The Wicked Witch of the West. And in the book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, that is supposed to be Silver Slippers. And the only reason it's ruby is because the movie company was showing off Technicolor and it became Ruby Slippers. And there they go. They're following the yellow brick road and they're going to Emerald City. Well, let's go back 127 years. And this campaign of 1896 still resonates 127 years later. It was a race between William McKinley, who was the Republican, and William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democrat. There was a depression or a panic in 1893, and that sets the stage for the 1896 presidential campaign. The Democratic Party's response to the crisis, people didn't like their response, and they voted for Republicans in 1894. Some Democrats agreed with President Grover Cleveland's support of the gold standard. Then these conservative Democrats were called the gold bugs, but the more rural, populist Democrats believed that inflation was the key to raising prices and easing the debt of the farmers. This election, 1896, we deal with consequences politically today. It is the last election where people went after the agricultural vote, thinking the agricultural vote would put them over the top. The Democrats did that. The Republicans, no, they're going after the city slickers, so to speak. So there's a realignment in terms of the political parties. Ever since the election of 1800, American presidential contests had, on some level, been a referendum on whether the country should be governed by the agricultural interests, the rural indebted farmers, the countryside, or Main Street, or should they be ruled by Wall Street? Does that sound familiar today, all these years later? Wall Street against Main Street? This is where it starts. This was the last election in which a candidate tried to win the White House with farmers. Votes for women. Who voted in 1896? Do you know that New Jersey, women could vote in New Jersey for a while? They could. New Jersey women voted 1776 to 1807. Why not now? Well, who were the voters back in 1896? Well, in the early days of America, when America was formed as a country, only white landowners were allowed to vote. In 1856, universal suffrage for white males granted in all states. If you were white, you didn't have to be a landowner anymore. You could vote. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution ratified granting the right to vote to African American men. Notice not any women, except women are slowly getting the vote. 1890, the state of Wyoming passes women's suffrage, becoming the first state to permanently grant women the right to vote. 1893, Colorado passes women's suffrage. In 1896, Utah and Idaho said, hey women, come on, you can vote. But those are 4 tiny states. This is not New York, this is not Pennsylvania, this is not Ohio, the big states, or Virginia in those days. Something else is going on in the country, in addition to some women voting, and also the switch to the city slickers. It's called electricity. And electricity is powering streetlights. It's also powering some apartments. This is Great Barrington in Massachusetts. And it says on 20 March 1886, William Stanley provided alternating current electrification to offices and stores on Main Street in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He thus demonstrated the first practical system for providing electrical illumination using alternate currents with transformers to adjust voltage levels of the distribution system. So you got electric, and you got something else coming, cars. This is the Henry Ford Museum, Dearborn, Michigan. And this is one of the first cars ever built. And this display has the car all pulled apart to see how they put the car together. So all of a sudden you got cars, and you got railroads, and you got electricity, and society is changing rapidly. You also have a telephone. This was the agricultural society that people were leaving behind. And then there were workers. Labor Day comes out of this time period. Workers wanted a bigger piece of the American pie, and they were going to get it if they had to strike and risk their lives in striking. The first Labor Day took place on September 5th, 1882 in New York City. The Central Labor Union of New York organized a parade of thousands of union members from all trades that culminated in a picnic for members and their families. By 1894, the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, sees that the workers are gaining power. 30 states recognized Labor Day as a holiday. And on June 28, 1894, Grover Cleveland signed the law officially making the first Monday of September a national holiday, Labor Day. But like I said, he may be honoring some workers, but there were strikes. Of course, there was the Panic of 1893 where the money supply dries up, particularly the farmers. But there's the Pullman strike. Pullman workers had formed a grievance committee to negotiate with the company, and they were getting nowhere. The American Railway Union leadership told the Pullman employees, don't go on strike. Don't go on strike. Let's see if you can work it out. But they struck the Pullman factories on May 11th, 1894. The American Railway Union launched a national boycott after that against all trains that carried Pullman passenger cars, which was a lot of trains. Well, Grover Cleveland's worried about the economy, and he orders the army to stop the strikers from obstructing the trains. Violence broke out in many cities. The strike collapsed by July 20th. People were killed. So you got the workers, you got the farmers, you got the Gilded Age people, and keep that in mind when I talk about the Wizard of Oz. The candidate, the Republican, William McKinley, promising prosperity at home, prestige abroad. It's important also to know. Commerce, civilization, and he's being held up by a gold coin. He was a gold guy. He was the Ohio governor, and he also was pushing the Republican platform to include protective tariffs, which would raise prices through the roof, but protect some American workers. By 1896, the Republican Party was ready to present itself as standing behind the farmer, the rising middle class, the Protestant industrial worker, through high taxes on foreign imports. McKinley, though, he did not want to talk about the money question, didn't want to talk about gold, didn't want to talk about silver. In fact, he thought nobody's going to talk about it after a while. This would turn out to be an important asset in the election where William Jennings Bryan focused entirely on the issue. So the 1896 election is all about money. It's the economy, stupid, and it was all about money. Who was this guy, William McKinley? Well, he truly was a Civil War hero for the Union side during the conflict. He began his military career in June of 1891 as a private in the 23rd Ohio Infantry. He was a Civil War hero. His general, Rutherford B. Hayes, sent him on a suicide mission to warn some aspects of the Union Army, hey, you're going to get cut off. He survived. Hayes said to him, I never thought I'd see you alive again. He was a real war hero. He became a lawyer after the war. He settled in Canton, Ohio. He married, assumed a variety of community leadership posts. He became active in the Republican Party circles, which led to his election. as the Stark County prosecutor in 1869. He was elected to Congress in 1877 and also 1885, and he served 2 terms as the Ohio governor, 1891 to 1895. William McKinley was raised by an abolitionist family. His mother, a Methodist, who was born in Portland, Poland, Ohio. And he was very sympathetic to African American causes. Didn't like Jim Crow, didn't like that at all, second-class citizenship for African Americans in the South. The Republican platform favored the gold standard, but left the door open for free coins of silver, or free coinage of silver. Also, let's get Hawaii. Let's get parts of the Danish West Indies. Let's build a canal in Central America. Why don't we expand the Navy? And let's sympathize with the revolutionaries in Cuba and Armenia. Oh, by the way, as far as this immigration goes, you know what? My family, some of them were illiterates. Anyway, let's throw out all of the illiterate immigrants. Let's try to push women's rights and, oh yeah, equal pay for equal work. So who was this guy McKinley who wanted the Danish West Indies, which today is the U.S. Virgin Islands? The Republican platform favored the gold standard. Well, they left the door open to the coinage of silver, and they wanted a whole bunch of things, and he was going to deliver. He wanted to expand the Republican base beyond the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant core, and he has an opportunity to do so at the St. Louis Republican Convention. Rabbi Samuel Sale delivered the first day invocation. It was the first time a rabbi, first time somebody who was Jewish, that would open up a political convention in American history. This was engineered by the managers of the presidential campaign. Look, the Republican Party wanted more people. And they had a problem with upscale Catholics and Protestant members of the staunchly anti-Catholic American Protective Association. So they figured, well, let's bring a rabbi here. A rabbi who's tied to the Democratic Party, and everybody will be happy. Well, he does that. Not only that, puts a coalition together that includes Croatian mine workers, Germany dairymen's groups, Swedish lumbermen, Italian glass makers guild, Confederate soldiers. He wants new faces in the party. And his message is this, very simply, we're all in this together. It's not them against us. Whereas William Jennings Bryan was, it's the farmers against the city slickers. So who was this guy, William Jennings Bryan? Well, he holds a significant place in American history. He was born in Salem, Illinois, March 19, 1860. Graduated from the Illinois College in 1881. From Union College of Law in 1883. Admitted to the Illinois State Bar in 1883. Practiced law in Jacksonville, Illinois, and then moved to Lincoln, Nebraska in 1887. He wins election to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1890 and serves there for 5 years, championing populist causes such as free coinage of silver, a national income tax, and the direct election of senators. You could vote for House members. You voted for people in your local state in the legislature who would then appoint senators. That's how it worked until about 1914. Since 1893, America had been mired in a deep economic depression marked by low prices, low profits, high unemployment, and violent strikes like the Pullman strike. Economic issues, especially silver or gold for money supply, tariffs, all essential issues, central issues as well. 1896, many inflationist farmers believed that by increasing the amount of currency in circulation, the crops they grew would receive higher prices. They were opposed by banks. Oh, that may be the wicked witch of the East, banks. And bondholders who feared inflation, and urban workers who fear inflation would further erode their purchasing power. And there's the candidate Bryan. He's 36 years old. Not a bad-looking guy. Of course, it didn't matter in those days. There was no such thing as TV. And if there was any film, it was really in its infancy. But anyway, there's William Jennings Bryan. He faced an uphill battle as the Democrat and populist nominee. Democrats had held the White House for the previous 4 years, and guess what? You're responsible for the economic depression. In early 1895, Congressman Richard Bland of Missouri and Bryan of Nebraska, a former congressman, led the revolt against Grover Cleveland. The populists in the Democratic Party are going to throw out the establishment. They argued that Cleveland's economic policies did not represent the party's mainstream support of free silver, and he has a statement, Bryant, that he is promoting, signed by 31 House Democrats, urging Democrats to become the party of free silver. 16 to 1. 16 to 1. One bit of silver is worth 16 times one bit of gold is worth 16 times the amount of silver. That summer, Bryan successfully had a speaking tour in the Midwest and the South. He attacked the money power in Washington and called for new party leadership. Sounds like Bernie Sanders, doesn't it? Yes or no?
Yes.
Sounds just like Bernie Sanders 4 or 8 years ago. Silver Democrats attempted to take control of the party's national organization, but Bryan worked alone to build a national free silver coalition of Democrats, Republicans, and populists. Hey, what do you think? Think I look good in a top hat? Top hat McCain? Think I look good? Think I would fit in the 1890s with a top hat and cane?
Sure.
Irving Berlin put on the Ritz, right? Right? Walking sticks and all that. Well, that's Grover Cleveland. And Grover Cleveland, like people who wore top hats and carried the sticks around. This is the Grover Cleveland birthplace in West Caldwell, New Jersey. It's a good place to go for 15 minutes. The curator of the museum is very knowledgeable about the Cleveland family, and she said, why don't you take a picture of how somebody would dress during those days? So that's why I have the top hat and the cape. Do you remember when people wore top hats? Nobody's worn the top hat in like 60 years or so. Maybe it's time to bring it back. Cleveland disapproved of Bryant's nomination. Many Democrats abandoned the party to form the Gold Democrats, or would vote for McKinley. Bryan, who barely acknowledged his nomination by the third-party populists, decided the best strategy for a Democratic victory was to bring his message to the people, speaking around the country, often on the backs of railroad cars. This was a new tactic. Presidential candidates stayed home. They never went to press the flesh. They let other people do that for them, but they stayed home. They didn't campaign. In fact, Warren G. Harding in 1920 didn't campaign either. And that would be, 24 years later. New tactic. It won Bryan both criticism and fame. It was the first time a presidential candidate hit the trail and pressed the flesh. So here's Bryan. Here's the free silver Frankenstein. Well, what do we do? What do we do? Do we go with the populists, we go with the Democrats, or we forget about William Jennings Bryan? The Democrats arrived at their convention in Chicago without a clear choice for the nomination. Congressman Richard P. Bland of Missouri was the leading candidate, but populists were hoping for a more free silver candidate, and there was also one other problem with Bland. His wife was a Catholic, and, well, Americans had problems with Catholics, like Al Smith in 1928 and John Kennedy in 1960, who was asked this question: who are you going to, who's your allegiance, to the Pope or to the United States? That was a problem. Bryan, taking advantage of the attention his work the previous year had earned him, and began writing delegates for support that spring. Although some delegates from the West and South intended to vote for him, a pre-convention poll just 2 days before the convention's opening ranked him last among the 7 candidates. On July 7th, the convention opened with the Silver Rights, establishing clear control. They get rid of the 2 candidates, adopt a free silver plank. That was written by William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan would give a masterful speech. It's It's one of the 3 most important convention speeches, according to historians, in the history of the United States. And it's called the Cross of Gold speech. I did this talk last Sunday, and I started talking about it, and the guy who's about 90 years old said, wait a second, I'm going to repeat it. I said, go ahead. And he did, word for word. The Cross of Gold speech. Bryant blamed the gold standard for impoverishing Americans and identified agriculture as the foundation of American wealth. He called for the reform of the monetary system, an end to the gold standard, and promised government relief efforts for farmers and others hurt by the economic depression. And this is the famous speech, and he put it on video. So generation upon generation upon generation upon generation could see this speech. Sounds biblical in nature. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world supported by the commercial interest, the laboring interest, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon the cross of gold. Won them the Democratic nomination. And it became a very famous speech, to the point where a guy who's like 90 could repeat it verbatim, which is probably more than most college kids taking American history who are talking about this election. Bryant took the lead on the 4th ballot, finally won on the 5th. He's 36 years old, youngest candidate ever nominated for the presidency of the United States, barely making it because you had to be at least 35 to run for president. Some Democrats broke with the mainstream of the party. Some in the Northeast privately and even publicly supported the Republican ticket, while some in the Midwest formed their own party called the National Democratic Party. In early September, the breakaway faction convened in Indianapolis, where they nominated Senator John Palmer of Illinois for president and Simon Bolivar Buckner, a former Confederate general and governor of Kentucky, for vice president. So here's Bryant, and he's got to do a balancing act. Does he go with the Democrats, or does he go with the populists? Well, he makes the decision. He's going with the Democratic Party, which doesn't make the Populist Party too happy with him, although they would nominate him. Populist Party grew out of the agricultural discontent of the 1890s, especially in the south and west of the Mississippi River. Grew out of the Farmers Alliance, whose main goal since 1876 had been to achieve economic reform in railroad and brokerage rates. They wanted to break their shipping their products. By 1896, following the panic or the depression of 1893, the party had become almost exclusively identified with the free silver movement. The inclusion of populist positions in the Democrats' platform caused the split in the Populist Party. Some populists, called fusionists, wanted to join the Democrats. The more radicals, mid-roaders, wanted to remain a separate organization and pursue a larger agenda. Well, there's a convention in St. Louis for the populists. And yeah, they get this platform there, they got all kinds of reforms, and they nominate Bryant for president. But the mid-roadsters didn't want him, and they started to protest. Then they threw the lights on, and then ended the protest. But Bryant's running mate on the Democratic ticket, Arthur Sewall, was not the populist vice presidential candidate. He was seen as too anti-labor. So instead, they nominated a guy by the name of Thomas E. Watson, a former populist congressman from Georgia. But the problem with Watson, he's not campaigning for Bryant. Bryant's on his own out there with the populists. That's a museum in New York. There's a museum on Fifth Avenue, the New York City Museum. And there's a whole display about the Gilded Age of New York City with top hats and canes and Vanderbilts and Carnegie and Sanford White and Jay Gould and John D. Rockefeller, all the people in the Gilded Age who used to play golf over in Ardsley and over in Yonkers back in the 1890s. The big industrialists, the Gilded Age, robber barons, William Jennings Bryan. The big industrialists and the bankers of the late 19th century really concerned about this guy, Bryan. They don't like him. They got to do something about it. Bryan despised the powerful business interests. Sounds like Bernie Sanders, doesn't it? The railroads, the industrialists, the financiers, like J.P. Morgan. In particular, he attacked the monopolies or the trust that the robber barons had created to minimize competition and maximize profits. A Bryan presidency represented a major threat to all the millionaires of the Gilded Age. The big money interests at first said, hey, we'll ignore him. Yeah, we'll ignore him. He's just this guy from Nebraska. No. But he was a great orator. And he went around the country. Traveled 18,000 miles in 3 months. Whipped up support with his message. The robber barons are alarmed. But they don't have to be too alarmed too much longer. Enter this guy, Mark Hanna. And what Mark Hanna did in 1896 still resonates in 2023. Mark Hanna was, he had a lot of money. He was an industrialist. He's 58 years old. He promoted William McKinley in the election, and he got the robber barons to put their dollars into American politics. Hanna used every means possible to sway delegates. He gained the support of Southerners, saying, hey, listen, we'll give you jobs. We'll give you jobs. Support us. He pledged to the Eastern delegates strong support for the gold currency. After all, Eastern delegates are connected to Wall Street. This put Hanna's candidate at odds with the silver Republicans in the western states, but didn't really matter. He had a winning coalition that got McKinley nominated on the first ballot. Hanna, well, he may have put $100,000 of his own money into the campaign. McKinley's campaign received unprecedented funding from wealthy individuals and corporations. Hanna starts with his old high school chum, John D. Rockefeller. Hey, Mr. Rockefeller, we need some money. He's the head of Standard Oil. He's also a snake oil salesman, but that's another story. But anyway, so he said, hey, is $250,000 enough? I am. Give it to me. J.P. Morgan said, $250,000 enough? Yeah. Bryan's most likely largest donor was the newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst, who gave him $40,000, but he also gave him hundreds of thousands of dollars of free publicity in his Hearst newspapers around the country. And there is Mark Hanna. See, he's got the top hat, he's got the cane, right? They walk with sticks and umbrellas. Senator Mark Hanna, he was a senator, said in 1895, there are two things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second one is. He directed a $3.5 million campaign, which actually today isn't all that much money, probably about $100 million. The costliest and best organized the nation had ever witnessed. And they spent, for every buck that Bryan put up, well, they put up 20. He hired 1,400, inundated the country with millions of pamphlets promising continuing prosperity with McKinley. Got a question for you. How many of you enjoy picking up robocalls? Political robocalls. How many of you enjoy listening to those? He kind of started it. It wasn't phone calls back in those days. It was sending direct mailings to your house. Once a week, vote for my candidate, and also inserts in newspapers. So it was the start of a new direction in campaigning, having surrogates talk to the candidates and sending mailings directly to households, vote for McKinley. And today it's calling your household, right? That's what it is today. So there were some accusations by some of the cartoonists of the day in newspapers that, well, look, McKinley's just hanging on some strings, and that Mark Hanna was the real puppeteer behind William McKinley. Well, Bryan goes 18,000 miles around the country, gives about 600 cross of gold speeches, while McKinley sat on his front porch welcoming trainloads of voters who traveled to Ohio, and Mark Hanna would pay for that to meet the Republican candidate. McKinley gave about $350 front porch speeches. So basically he went inside, came out, gave a speech, went back inside, did this all day. Hanna succeeded in stunting Bryan's grassroots appeal with a continual barrage of posters and propaganda that preceded and followed Bryan at every whistle stop of his campaign trail. Hanna was ridiculed by cartoonists who called him Dollar Mark. And here's William McKinley. He's right over here, right in the middle of that picture. And if you wanted to see William McKinley, hey, just get in touch with Mark Hanna. He'll take care of it. You want to go see him? He'll take care of it, no problem. McKinley made himself available to the public every day except Sunday. After all, he needed a day of rest. Receiving delegations from the front porch of his home. The railroads, the Vanderbilts, subsidized the visitors with low excursion rates. The pro-silver Cleveland Plain Dealer. I wrote once for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, thank you Gloria Milner, about 25 years ago. I wrote op-ed pieces for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. So, yeah, I'm connected to this in kind of a way. The Cleveland Plain Dealer disgustedly stated that going to Canton had been made cheaper than staying at home. Hey, would you go to Canton if somebody picked up all your expenses? You know, go there for the day? Well, Mark Hanna would do that. Delegations marched through the streets from the railroad station to McKinley's home on North Market Street. Once there, they crowded close to the front porch. Their spokesmen, and it was all men back then, addressed McKinley. The candidate then responded, speaking on campaign issues in the speech molded to suit the interests of the delegation. Speeches were carefully scripted to avoid extemporaneous remarks. Even the spokesman's remarks were approved by McKinley or his representative. So it's all about money. Isn't it always all about money? Is it never all about money? Is it ever about character? No. No. Ever about issues? Yeah, one issue. Money. It's all about money. McKinley thought of himself as a tariff man, expected that the monetary issues would fade in a month or so. He was mistaken. Silver and gold dominated the campaign. The battleground, the Midwest. The South and most of the West were conceded to Bryan. And the Democrats spent much of his time, Bryant, in the battleground states. The Northeast was safe for McKinley. After all, that's where Wall Street lived. And it's particularly after early voting states such as Maine and Vermont supported in September. And also, one other thing. The Republicans managed to attract some urban progressive voters by attacking Bryan as a religious fanatic, in addition to painting a dire picture of what abandoning the gold standard would mean for the United States economy. So here it is. Here you got McKinley, and you got Bryant, and it says Bryan is the ablest worker for sound money. In this cartoon, magazine Puck, 10 cents. 10 cents was a lot of money back in the 1890s, 1896. November 3rd, the voters had their say. McKinley won the entire Northeast in the Midwest. But he only won 51% of the vote, which is not really a mandate. But he got an ample majority in the Electoral College. McKinley gained strength from the prosperous Midwest farmers, industrial workers, and many ethnic voters, including the immigrants who came to the United States, who became citizens. Bryan had concentrated entirely on the silver issue, didn't appeal to urban workers. Voters in the cities voted for him in only one city that had more than 100,000 in population, was carried by Bryan, and that was in Denver, Colorado. And there is this change in America. And remember, those days, Brooklyn was a separate city. That's Brooklyn to my right, your left, and that's Manhattan to the right. That's the Manhattan Bridge behind me, and back there is the Brooklyn Bridge. So there is a change in America. Change is coming. It's even a subway station coming. That would come in 1898 in Boston. The 1896 election marked the decisive triumph of the nation's urban interests, banking, manufacturing and industry over agriculture. With Americans migrating to cities, And migrating included the Ellis Island crew that came over. At a rapidly increasing rate in the last decade of the 19th century, Bryant would be the last candidate to run by appealing exclusively to the country's rural population. The bad economy powered McKinley to victory on the strength of the electoral map. The unemployment rate was 12.4% his first year in office, but it fell to 5%. By the time he had to run for re-election in 1900, Bryant would be the candidate again in 1900, and he would crush it. There were a couple things that helped William McKinley. He got lucky. There was the discovery of gold in the Klondike, Yukon, Canada. And that made San Francisco and that made Seattle, two of the last stops before you hit land to go to Dawson City, made them centers, economic centers, because you either took you bought your supplies in San Francisco, you went up to the Klondike, you bought your supplies in Seattle, you went up to the Klondike. So that helped out an awful lot. And that helped stabilize the American economy. And he began to flex America's military muscle beyond North America with Hawaii and Cuba in his sight. Remember, that was part of their plank, become more involved in the world. And is San Juan, Puerto Rico behind me. McKinley would lead the way to American imperialism and colonialism. A war with Spain would get America, Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba. America was expanding. It would start with the military occupation of Manila, then the annexation of the entire Philippines. And this place, Hawaii. Anybody ever read James Michener's book, Hawaii? It's a good book. It tells you pretty much the history of Hawaii, which isn't actually rather nice for Americans. Anyway, Mark Twain stood there. There's a plaque right underneath. You can't see it because it's on the rock. It said Mark Twain was here. Called it one of the most beautiful vistas he's ever seen. This is outside of Honolulu and Oahu in one of the Hawaiian Islands. It's John Tyler with that Tippecanoe. Tyler too. He becomes the president in 1841 after William Henry Harrison dies. About 31 days after he's inaugurated in March of 1841. Beginning in 1842, President John Tyler gave notice to European nations that the United States would never consent to their occupying the Hawaiian Islands. Secretary of State there is Daniel Webster, who looks like you don't want to mess with him. For most of the 1800s, leaders in Washington were concerned that Hawaii might become part of a European nation's empire. During the 1830s, Britain and France forced Hawaii, and there was the Kingdom of Hawaii at that point, to accept treaties giving them economic privileges. 1842, the Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, sent a letter to Hawaiian agents in Washington affirming U.S. interests in Hawaii and opposing annexation by any other nation. Except they were a nation. It was the Kingdom of Hawaii. They were an independent nation. Webster also proposed to Great Britain and France that no nation should seek special privileges or engage in the further colonization of the islands. 1849, the United States and Hawaii concluded the Treaty of Friendship that served as basis of official relations between the two parties. Hey, Napoleon III, can't touch this. No, can't do it. 1851, when the French were threatened to occupy Hawaii, Daniel Webster, then the Secretary of State, wrote, "Hope the French will not take possession of Hawaii, but if they do, they'll be dislodged if my advice is taken, if the whole power of the government is required to do it." Well, it lays there for a while. This is what Webster really wanted, this narrow channel outside of center of Honolulu. You probably know it better as Pearl Harbor. This is what he wanted back when it was a much smaller port, but that's what he wanted. Hawaii would give America a place where a defense base could be located, Pearl Harbor, and an opportunity to control the Pacific. That won't come for decades, till 1893. Here's the Queen, Liliuokalani, and she is the last of the royals who ruled Hawaii. 1893, she announced plans for a new constitution. January 14, 1893, a group of mostly Euro-American business leaders and residents formed the Committee of Safety. That's what they called it, Committee of Safety. And this was the sugar lobby. To stage a coup d'etat against the kingdom and seek annexation by the United States. United States government minister John L. Stevens, responding to a request from the Committee of Safety, they were real safety, right? Summoned a company of U.S. Marines, and that's the Palace in Honolulu. A descendant of an American missionary community to Hawaii, Dole advocated the westernization and destruction of the Hawaiian government and culture. Get rid of the entire culture. After the overthrow of the monarchy, he served as president of Hawaii until his government secured Hawaii's annexation by the United States. And there is Dole. Hey, can you trust a guy who has a beard like that? Shouldn't it be more groomed? Doesn't look like it's even, does it? Two sides. He was an American lawyer. He becomes the president of the Republic when the provisional government of Hawaii ended on July 4th, 1894. Controversy ensued in the following years as the Queen tried to regain her throne. And this guy, Grover Cleveland, is absolutely useless. He is the president of the United States and he has no power over what's going on in Hawaii. The administration of the President Grover Cleveland commissioned the Blount Report and concluded that the removal of the Queen had been illegal. The U.S. government first demanded that the Queen be reinstated. The provisional government said, "Who are you? You're Grover Cleveland. You don't matter to us." And they stayed. And it becomes the Hawaiian Republic. And it was still its own country by that point, but these guys didn't really want to be their own country. Loren A. Thurston declined the presidency of the Republic, and Dole was chosen to lead the government instead. He'd be the first and only president from 1894 to 1898. So Dole says to Thurston, go to Washington, get us annexed. Dole was successful as a diplomat. Every nation that recognized the Kingdom of Hawaii also recognized his government. And that's the McKinley statue in Buffalo, New York in 2003 when I took my son up to SUNY Buffalo where he was looking for a college. And there is William McKinley out there. McKinley was open to persuasion by U.S. expansionists and annexationists from Hawaii. He met with Thurston, with Francis March Hatch, and William Ansel Kinney. After negotiations in June 1897, the Secretary of State John Sherman agreed to the Treaty of Annexation with these representatives from the Republic of Hawaii. Remember the Maine! Remember the Maine? Kids today have no idea what that means. Have no idea what that means. Destruction of the warship. William Randolph Hearst is ready to give you $50,000 if he can find who blew up the Maine. And also to start a war, because as he said, you know, hey, you start the war, we'll supply the pictures. The McKinley administration used the Spanish-American War as pretext to annex the independent state of Hawaii. Supporters of the annexations argued that Hawaii was vital to the U.S. economy, that it would serve as a strategic base that could help protect U.S. interests in Asia, and that other nations were intent on taking over the islands if the United States did it. And that is Hawaii's new government with Dole there with his beard right in the middle. He looks like one of the Smith Brothers cough drops guys, doesn't he? Smith Brothers. The Newlands Resolution was used to annex the Republic to the U.S., became the territory of Hawaii. The Newlands Resolution was passed by the House of Representatives June 15, 1898. 209 to 91. The Senate passed it on July 6, 1898, 42 to 21. McKinley wanted a joint resolution of Congress to make it a U.S. territory. He gets that. August 12, 1898. The sugar lobby, they got what they wanted, and the United States got what it wanted. Military base, which generations later would become central to another war in World War II on December 7th, 1941. Spanish-American War. And there are the guys fighting the Spanish-American War from the Cuban side. The United States declared war on Spain on April 25th, 1898. Americans rallied to the cause of liberating Cuba from Spain with the slogan, "Remember the Maine." Spain was not, well, they were not really prepared for war with a formidable power. The U.S. was equally unprepared as far as their army, but the outcome of the war was largely dependent on sea power, and in this element, the United States completely outclassed its opponent. McKinley, here's a cannon from that war, 1898 through 99. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippine Islands. That's a war. That's a war memorial. Well, it also shows U.S. power back in those days. By July 17, 1898, the war was over. Treaty is signed on August 12, 1898. McKinley's America becomes global power. They add Cuba, Guam, and Puerto Rico to its portfolio. And then there's the Philippines in the Battle of Manila. And William McKinley decided, yeah, we should be there. McKinley decided the United States must take possession of the 7,000 islands and the 7 million people who live there. This demand was reluctantly agreed to by Spain. The United States gave them $20 million as a parting gift for public buildings and public works in the Philippines. The Treaty of Paris was signed on December 10, 1898, and those were the terms. Now, you're wondering about the Wizard of Oz, right? How many of you wondering about the Wizard of Oz? How many of you read the book? How many of you saw the movie? Everybody in here has seen the movie, right? Had to see it once. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Pictures by W. W. Denslow. I guess that is the Cowardly Lion, right? He's wearing glasses. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published in 1900. It's the first fantasy written by an American, Frank Baum, to enjoy immediate success upon its publication. The first edition of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was illustrated by Denslow. Baum went on to write 14 books in the Oz series, beginning with The Marvelous Land of Oz, 1904, and ending with Glinda of Oz, published after his death in 1920. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was the basis for the film The Wizard of Oz, which came out in 1939. Well, does it make any sense that The Wizard of Oz was based on the 1896 election? By the way, anybody hear about this ever? A guy literally down the road came up with this theory. That's William James Bryan. There's no direct evidence that the 1896 election itself inspired Frank Baum to write The Wizard of Oz. But Henry M. Littlefield had his interpretation. He was an American educator. He was an author. He was a historian. And he claimed that Baum's Wizard of Oz was a political satire. Well, it was a long tradition of political interpretations in this book, or would start the long tradition of the political interpretations of this book. He wrote an essay to this effect for high school students in Mount Vernon, New York, published it in the American Quarterly in 1964. Anybody live in Mount Vernon, New York back in the 50s, 60s? You did. Your kids go to Mount Vernon High School? No. My wife's family's from Mount Vernon. And my wife, after I was explaining this to her, said, you know, I had rotten history teachers. He might have made it interesting if I had his class. He was in school, I just wasn't in his class. Perhaps her sister was in the class, or her brother. And there he is, the guy in the middle. He was also the Mount Vernon High School wrestling coach. Littlefield asserted that Baum had written The Wonderful Wizard of Oz as a political allegory in which the characters represented various aspects of the 1896 election, when the populist movement mounted a serious challenge to the two major parties in American politics. According to Littlefield, Dorothy is Baum's Miss Everything. Everything. She's the center of the story, obviously. I mean, she's gets caught in the tornado and with her dog, and yeah, the rest of the story goes afterwards. Accompanying Dorothy on her journey down the Yellow Brick Road, or the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, which Littlefield noticed served as apt symbols for the farmers and industrial workers. Baum's Scarecrow is a response to the prejudicial notion that farmers were not smart enough to recognize their own interests. Sentiment expressed by William Allen White in his 1896 editorial, "What's the Matter with Kansas?" Well, here they are. Who are they? There she is with the Cowardly Lion. Tin Man, played by Jack Haley. I knew his son, Jack Haley Jr., played with the Chicago Bulls, and I was talking to him one day about his father, and he said his father almost died during the filming because they painted him silver, clogged up his paws.
Oh, no.
Pores. So anyway, there he is, Jack Haley, Ray Bolger, and Judy Garland, and Burt Lahr. The theory. The Tin Man. Who's the Tin Man? Dehumanized by factory labor, rusted solid, symbolizing the closing of factories during the Depression of 1893. The Cowardly Lion, William Jennings Bryan. Democratic nominee in 1896, endorsed by the Populist Party. When the Cowardly Lion first meets Dorothy and her companions, he strikes the Tin Man. Doesn't make a dent in his metal body. Littlefield equates the Cowardly Lion's futile act with Bryan's failure to win the vote of industrial labor. The Wicked Witch of the East, who you never see, right? You never see the Wicked Witch of the East in the movie. Represents the bankers, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Goulds, those people. And the Wicked Witch of the West gets killed by water. Well, it was a drought. A drought which hurt farmers between 1891 and 1894. And the Yellow Brick Road represents the gold standard. And the silver shoes in the book, not the ruby slippers in the 1939 film version, represents the Silverite, 16-to-1 silver ratio. They're dancing down the road. There are suggestions that the city of Oz earns its name from the abbreviation OZ, in which gold and silver are measured, ounces, OZ. The theory, it's only a theory, and it was pretty much forgotten for a while. Littlefield students were enthused, but the article languished until 1977 when Gore Vidal wrote about it in the New York Review of Books. L. Frank Baum's introduction claims the Wonderful Wizard of Oz was written solely to pleasure children today. 1900 doesn't mean anything. But by the mid-1980s, Littlefield's thesis about Oz and populism had developed its own academic niche. Just a theory. Just a theory. By the way, do you believe that the 1896 campaign was the story of the Wizard of Oz? Yes or no? No. Writer's right. But it's a nice attempt to try to analyze something. I mean, people try to analyze a lot of stuff. Like, my wife took musical theory at Juilliard. She was telling one of the professors, said, well, analyze what Bach was doing. I don't know. Sounded good. Sounded good to him. That's basically it, right? Oh, no, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. Ernest Thayer's book, poem, The Mighty Casey Struck Out. How many you're familiar with The Mighty Casey, right? Strikes out when the base is loaded. Must mean man's failures has a chance to succeed. Thayer in 1935 said, it's just a throwaway. Casey at the bat is just a throwaway. There's no basis in fact for it. So it's just a theory. Oh, 1939, Wizard of Oz movie was a box office bomb, dismissed by critics. It was accepted as a classic movie by viewers once it was shown annually on TV starting in 1956. Meanwhile, the 1900 election, McKinley and Roosevelt are elected. It was a rematch of the 1896 election. McKinley had turned the economy around. There was that victory in the Spanish-American War, and Bryant was anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. and he wanted to continue support for bimetallism, gold and silver, and nobody was interested. McKinley is assassinated in 1901. He dies on September 14, 1901, complications from bullets inflicted by Leon Zalgas. He was an anarchist. He shot the president during one of his public appearances at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York on September 6th. McKinley was 58, succeeded by Teddy Roosevelt. On September 23rd, Zalgas' trial began. 3 days later, a jury found him guilty, sentenced him to death. He was executed on October 29th. So why did this guy shoot and kill William McKinley? Well, these were his last words. I shot the president because I thought it would help the working people and for the sake of the common people. I'm not sorry for my crime. I'm awfully sorry because I could not see my father. I don't remember in 1961, the 60th anniversary of McKinley's assassination, anybody celebrating it. But I guarantee you this year, November 22nd, the 60th anniversary of the John F. Kennedy assassination, you will see people talk about it. And that'll probably be the last time most people will talk about the Kennedy assassination because I'm 67. I remember it rather well, but I'm probably one of the youngest people who remembers it rather well. Bryan after 1900. Well, he wasn't done running for president. There he is with Clarence Darrow. The Democratic Party nominated Bryan as its candidate for president in 1900. He lost 3 elections. President Woodrow Wilson selected Bryan as his Secretary of State following the 1912 presidential election. He resigned on June 9, 1915 after disagreements with Wilson over protecting Americans traveling on the Atlantic Ocean. The U-boats are out there, and Bryan's worried about Americans crossing the ocean. Bryan continued to write and lecture and oppose Clarence Darrow as the counsel in the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee. 1925, high school biology teacher John Scopes went on trial in Tennessee as a test of the first state law banning the teaching of evolution. There's still, 98 years later, we're still having the same thing going on in Tennessee in some ways. Bryan signed on as prosecutor, facing off against the criminal defense attorney Clarence Darrow. The Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee played out under the national spotlight. Our trial of the century, till OJ and the white Bronco chase, Ford Bronco chase in 1994, with journalists, religious leaders, and onlookers crowding the courtroom. And there is Bryan fanning himself off in the hot, hot courtroom. After the defense called Bryan himself as an expert on the Bible, Darrow subjected him to a brutal examination in the sweltering courtroom. And Bryan really didn't know all that much about the Bible or scientific knowledge. The jury found Scopes guilty. 9 minutes. Hi, how are you? Glad to meet you. Oh, is he guilty? Yeah, okay, we're done. Bye. Took 9 minutes to pronounce Scopes guilty. Scopes was fined $100. Probably now about $4,000. Bryan's performance in the trial and his thrashing in the national press marked a less than stellar end to his long career as a public figure. On July 26, 1925, 5 days after the verdict was issued, Bryan died in his sleep, suffered a stroke. But there were some things that came out of this, including Inherit the Wind. How many of you saw Inherit the Wind? Which I believe is banned in some southern states, or was tried to be banned. Spencer Tracy, Frederick March, Gene Kelly, Inherit the Wind. 1955, a play written by Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee about the Scopes trial called Inherit the Wind debuted in Dallas, Texas. Film based on the play starring Spencer Tracy and Frederick March premiered in 1960. Meanwhile, what's Mark Hanna's legacy? Well, it depends on who you talk to. Talk to Bernie Sanders, he detests him. Talk to 98% of politicians, they love him. 1907, Congress passed the Tillman Act, which banned corporate contributions to political campaigns. June 25, 2007, in the 5-4 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court gave the green light to such contributions. After today, Justice David Souter wrote in his dissent to the decision, Federal Election Commission versus Wisconsin Right to Life, the ban on contributions by corporations and unions, and the limitation on their corrosive spending when they enter the political arena are open to easy circumvention. And that is what is going on today. Oh, remember the song It's All in the Game by Tommy Edwards in 1958? It was a #1 single. All in the Game, recorded and featured Tommy Edwards on MGM Records. And there's the sheet music, rhythmic music, the sheet music. It's All in the Game is a pop song whose most successful version was recorded by Tommy Edwards in 1958. Carl Sigman composed the lyrics in 1951 to a wordless 1911 composition titled A Melody in A Major, written by Charles G. Dawes, who was later Vice President of the United States under Calvin Coolidge. Dawes was part of McKinley's team in 1896. It's the only #1 single in America to have been co-written by a vice president or a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1925. And he shares that distinction with another rock and roller. And there is Dawes. Dawes' prominent positions in business caught the attention of Republican Party leaders. They asked the 31-year-old Dawes to manage the Illinois portion of William McKinley's bid to the presidency of the United States, 1896. Dawes delivers Illinois to McKinley. Dawes and Sonny Bono. Sonny Bono, Sonny and Cher, right? This guy's from 1896, right? McKinley finds him. Dawes and Sonny Bono are the only people credited with a #1 pop hit who are also members of the United States Senate or House of Representatives. Dawes and Bob Dylan, as a writer, are the only persons credited with a #1 pop hit to also have won a Nobel Prize. This is 1896, and the guy is still relevant, as is the campaign of 1896. Thank you very much. Any questions, any comments? What do you think about The Wizard of Oz?
Love it.
No, about the 1896. Do you know when The Wizard of Oz came out, 1939, it was a box office bomb. Did poorly at the box office. The critics savaged it. They thought it was the worst thing going. Yeah, there were some Academy Awards won for the music and all that, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. But the critics hated it. And yet, somehow, it's still around, right? It's still around. Wicked Witch of the West and all of that. So, that all came out of a campaign that was run 127 years ago. And it's so relevant today. So any questions, any comments? Go ahead.
Somewhere Over the Rainbow.
It's a great song. It's a great song. But the movie was panned by the critics. They hated it. They said there were characters were awful and all that stuff. So, but it was what it was.